to Impact's third webinar of the year. For those of you I haven't met before, my name is Nancy Butcher and I'm the co-director of Impact. Impact is a clinical trials training platform funded by CHR that aims to increase capacity for perinatal and pediatric clinical trials in Canada through our fellowship program and educational activities such as these webinars. Today, we are honored and delighted to have Dr. Tamara Lewis with us here from the Hospital for Sick Children. Dr. Lewis is a physician scientist and a division head for clinical pharmacology and toxicology at Sick Kids. She's going to speak with us for about 45 minutes, and then we will have an open Q&A session until the top of the hour. And this will be followed, as usual, with a closed discussion period between her and the Impact Fellows and the enrichment group learners. So over to you, Tamara.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you to the leaders at Impact who invited me to be part of this really important webinar series. As mentioned, my name is Tamara, and I'm a neonatologist and pediatric clinical pharmacologist. And I just moved to Canada a little over 2 years ago. So I'm from the US and I trained and did my prior faculty roles there. And so this is a topic, diversity in clinical trials and health equity is a topic that's very, very important to me. And I'm excited to be able to share this passion with the Impact trainees and the rest of the audience today. So I wanted to start with the land acknowledgement. Sorry, in my office, you might hear some codes.
All clear. Code wide, all clear. Code wide, all clear.
Okay, so we begin by acknowledging the land on which Sick Kids operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, Toronto is home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are committed to working towards new relationships that include First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And we are grateful for the opportunity to share this land in caring for children and their families. So because I know that the audience is a mixed crowd of clinicians, scientists, and different trainees, I wanted to just briefly tell you about my other hat that I wear outside of talking about diversity in clinical trials. So I'm a neonatologist, meaning a pediatrician that takes care of preterm and full-term infants. And my research program is actually in neonatal clinical pharmacology. So we do studies to understand currently used drugs in the NICU and hopefully future drugs that are going to be developed for use in the NICU. So my typical hat is as a clinical neonatologist and a neonatal pharmacology researcher, but today I'm really excited to talk to you about diversity in clinical trials. So I want to start my talk just with a few questions for the audience to help us really ground ourselves in why we are here today and why is this lecture something that I take the time to deliver. And these questions are, do all families deserve an equitable opportunity to participate in research? Do all children deserve the benefit from advances in research knowledge? And essentially, who's responsible? So are research teams the ones who are responsible for ensuring that clinical research is diverse and that clinical trial results reflect the populations who are affected by disease? So I'm going to start with a short story. So once as a faculty member, very early after finishing my fellowship, I was sitting in a research seminar and some very well-known clinician scientists were discussing results about a large randomized controlled trial that they had completed in pregnant women. And during this presentation, the research team was saying sentences such that minority women were less compliant with their study drug compared to white women, and this really impaired our ability to analyze the results and to generate good conclusions. And of course, this type of comment was agitating to me. And so when I asked the research team, can you talk more about this? What were some of the reasons that the minority women voiced for decreased compliance? It was revealed that there actually were multiple valid concerns, specifically from Black women in this trial happened in Kansas City, Missouri. And so, I show this as an example of oftentimes research teams can take low diversity enrollment, or research teams can take, something such as low compliance with study drugs from certain racial groups, and we can blame those marginalized communities for the outcomes that we don't want to see. But my hope in giving this talk, and by the end of this talk, is that really we can all understand and accept that really it's the biomedical research complex that has to take ownership and take responsibility of how we have historically failed to prioritize marginalized communities, and how in many ways we continue to fail to prioritize marginalized communities in our clinical trials and in our clinical research. So the objectives today are to understand the role that historical and ongoing marginalization play in research participation, to discuss how research findings in racial and ethnically homogeneous populations are not generalizable to all children, and then to describe some discrete examples of research approaches that can help us improve diversity and inclusion in our pediatric clinical trials. So since I'm new to Canada, I had to spend some time really learning about the rich racial and ethnic diversity in Toronto and Ontario, which is the province where I will be conducting my clinical research and my trials. And what you can see here is that in 2016, 30% of Ontario's total population self-identified as a visible minority. And what's also interesting is that the majority of those who identify this way live in Ontario's urban cities, including Toronto. And so I think, as a basis for starting to think about diversity and inclusion in clinical trials, it's important for each research team to really understand what are the demographics of your city, what are the demographics of your province, and what are the populations that might have unique challenges participating in clinical trials, which we'll talk about more in future slides. So there is an important pause when we kind of distinguish these two concepts of race versus ethnicity, because sometimes in biomedical research, we use these terms interchangeably. So race is really a social construct that people use to judge and categorize people based on perceived differences in physical appearance. And the goal of this categorization is to create and maintain power differentials within social hierarchies. So what we know from many different studies is that there's really no scientifically supported biological basis for how we currently define discrete racial groups. On the other hand, ethnicity is a multidimensional concept that refers to a community belonging and a shared cultural group membership. And ethnicity can be related to sociodemographic characteristics like language, religion, geographic origin, traditions, migration history, and many other things. And so I think it's important for us as researchers when we talk about race and ethnicity to really understand the nuanced differences between these two, and to make sure that we really understand what are we collecting when we collect this important demographic information. So when we serve such an incredibly diverse patient population, as displayed on the slide 2 slides ago, it's really critical for us as researchers to consider really deeply, why is it important that diversity and equity in research must be prioritized? So first is this concept of health equity. So we know from a lot of research, most of which originates in the United States, because they have been collecting racial and demographic information in medical care for a lot longer than Canada, which the tide is changing in Canada to start to collect racial and demographic information. But what we know from research is that different racial and ethnic groups definitely have variation in health outcomes, have variation in disease prevalence, and also variation in response to treatments. And by increasing diversity in our research, we as scientists can better understand what causes these variations. And importantly, we can develop healthcare interventions that are more effective and lead to more equitable outcomes for racial and ethnic groups. Second is generalizability. So in clinical research, we aim to generate findings that can be applied to broader populations outside of our small kind of research cohort. But if research participants are predominantly from one racial or ethnic group, the results may not be applicable, and it may also be unsafe to apply those results to other patient groups. So a lack of diversity in trials can lead to limited generalizability of our study findings. And lastly, it's important to identify disparities. So clinical research that includes diverse populations can help us identify and address health disparities that affect certain racial or ethnic groups. And if we can use our power to understand the root cause of racial health disparities, we can then crucially develop targeted interventions in order to decrease these disparities. Next is the issue of safety and efficacy. So we know that drug metabolism, drug side effects, and treatment response can vary among different racial and ethnic groups. And that can be from a multitude of factors. It can be from varying environmental exposures, varying diet, varying types of stressors, all that are outside of our very discrete clinical trial intervention. And so without diverse representation in our trials, we can miss important potential safety issues, and we can miss signals where a treatment can actually be less effective for certain subpopulations of individuals. If we don't have a diverse clinical trial, we'll never be able to detect these signals. Next is scientific rigor. So a diverse study population enhances the robustness and reliability of our research findings because it accounts for potential confounding factors that are related to race and ethnicity. And lastly, public trust. So this is very important. Ensuring diversity in clinical research can help the healthcare system and the research system foster greater trust and engagement among communities that have historically been marginalized and mistreated in medical research. So building trust is really a crucial part for recruiting participants and conducting ethical research in the future. So what evidence do we have for pediatric clinical trial diversity? Some of the best evidence comes from a recently published article in JAMA Pediatrics in 2022. And basically, the authors assessed published pediatric clinical trial reports in the top 10 journals, and these papers were published between 2011 and 2020. And you can see the journals that the authors used listed on this slide. They chose 5 leading general pediatric journals and 5 leading general medical journals. And in this study, what they found is that among papers that did report race and ethnicity demographics, Black and African American children were enrolled proportionately more than the United States population. Hispanic and Latino children were enrolled commensurate with the US population, and American Indian, Asian, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander children were enrolled significantly less compared with their respective US populations. White children were enrolled less than expected, but still represented 46% of participants in the trials that did report race and ethnicity. And what's really important is that of the 612 articles, the majority reported race, some reported ethnicity, but there are many trials where that information was missing. And so we have to sort of interpret these results with that caveat in mind. In addition to looking at racial and ethnic groups, the authors of this paper also created a trial diversity index that ranged from 0, meaning no diversity, to 1, meaning all racial and ethnic groups were equitably represented compared to their population numbers. And what you can see is that the diversity index was relatively stable over the decade that they assessed. And the diversity index was also higher in the subgroup of trials that were larger, that had over 500 participants. So I think this is some of the best kind of big data that we have about the current state of diversity in pediatric clinical trials. And while this paper did show promising results that some historically marginalized communities have equitable representation in research, I think there's some really important caveats. And I want to encourage you to look at the accompanying editorial that is cited at the bottom of this slide. There was a very nice editorial that went along with this JAMA Peds publication. And some of these caveats from this editorial is that if you really drill down and look at disease-specific clinical trials, they are less reliably diverse. So for example, within pediatric asthma, that we know has worse severity in Black and Hispanic children, if you look at clinical trials of monoclonal antibodies, they have as few as 3% Black children and 0% Hispanic children enrolled. And thus, to be truly equitable, we have to go beyond this concept of population matching, where we match, how common is it to be in the trial versus how common are they in the general population, and actually aim to match the clinical trial populations with the patient populations that have the highest prevalence and the highest morbidity of the disease. We also know that racialized children are less well represented in genetic and genomic research, and this places them at risk of less benefit from this new era of precision medicine. And right now, from what I understand, Health Canada does not track or publish the diversity within regulatory clinical trials. So I'm going to show you an example from the United States Food and Drug Administration, where they have actually been extremely proactive in tracking and working to improve clinical trial diversity. And the FDA regularly publishes diversity data on their website. And what you can see here is that they published data from all FDA-approved drugs between 2015 and 2019. And this was almost 300,000 different participants in clinical trials. And what you can see is that reliably, Black patients, Hispanic patients were underrepresented compared to the population percentage that they represent. What you can also see is that based on this data that the FDA accumulated over time, they started a new endeavor. And in 2022, they published a diversity plan to improve enrollment of participants from marginalized groups. And after publication of this guidance, FDA now actually requires that every clinical trial sponsor submit a document called a diversity action plan to the FDA when they put in their phase 3 or pivotal clinical trials. So in the US, they've actually been very intentional about this, and the FDA has created guidance and now has a regulatory requirement for diversity action plans. I want to take a moment to specifically discuss genomic research in children. So why is diversity and equity important for genomic research in particular? So we know that genomic medicine in 2024 really informs many facets of what we do. So we use this to help with disease prevention, diagnosis, therapeutic intervention choice, and then to help us understand efficacy and toxicity of some of our therapies. We also know that genomic medicine knowledge is not generalizable to historically excluded populations. And a really good example of this is warfarin pharmacogenetics. So the original studies to understand genetic influence on warfarin dose and safety were done in almost universally white patient populations. And they developed sort of pharmacogenetic dosing equations in these white populations. And then after the study was published, they applied these equations to all patients and actually found that the equations performed very well in white Americans, but performed very poorly in Black Americans, and actually led to some safety concerns in non-white patients. So that's a clear example where the data was not generalizable. And what we also know is that genetic variants that are common in groups of patients that are excluded, but the variants are rare or absent in European populations, cannot be discovered, even if we have very large European sample sizes. And here on this slide are two examples of genomic findings that were only discovered after they did dedicated studies in underrepresented patient populations. What we also know is that our current reference genomes and our current GWAS data is not diverse. And you can see in the figure that if you look at these catalogs of genomic data, there are very few underrepresented minorities represented in both cancer and non-cancer databases. And the underrepresentation of these non-European populations is really problematic because it can cause us to miss gene-disease relationships for which the exposure or the outcome is rare in European populations. It limits the generalizability, and it limits the evidence base when clinicians try to translate these genomic findings into their diverse patient populations. Also, we know that there are elevated rates of variants of unknown significance in the groups that have historically been excluded, and we can misapply precision therapies, like I mentioned in the warfarin example, when we try to take primarily European-founded information and apply it in other populations. And overall, this lack of diversity in genomic research can create new health disparities or exacerbate existing health disparities. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what are some of the examples of structural disadvantage that marginalized families and populations face, and how can these disadvantages impact their ability to participate in our clinical trials. So, what do I mean by this term structural disadvantage? It's not a term that we really learn in medical school or in our research degrees. So when I say this, I mean that there is disadvantage that is experienced by some individuals or families or communities as a result of the way society is designed and the way society functions. Some examples of this are how are resources distributed? How do people relate to each other on an interpersonal level and at an institutional level? Who has power in different social and medical interactions, and how are institutions organized? Are institutions organized to serve certain populations better than they serve others? And what we know is that patients from different races, different ethnicities, different ability status, all these different demographic variables really can affect how they experience some of these social and economic drivers of poor health. So I have on this slide here different social and economic drivers of poor health outcomes, but I think these drivers, especially the ones that I've circled in red, also can really affect a family's ability to engage with research. And what's interesting is that in clinical trials, think about how meticulous we are. We meticulously measure our health outcome of interest, our endpoint of the clinical trial. But you can imagine how if we only enroll a very heterogeneous group of patients, we can really limit the generalizability of our results because we don't have diversity in these social factors and these economic factors that can affect our clinical trial outcomes. So a research program that is really committed to equity and justice might take a significant amount of time to think about these variables on this slide and how do these variables affect their clinical trial screening, their clinical trial enrollment. How do these factors affect their clinical trial measurements and their outcomes? And then with this information in mind, how can we write our protocols such that we can really account for these variable lived experiences? So in Toronto, we know that there's racial segregation in housing, and racial segregation in housing can have impacts on access to healthy spaces for families to live, and also can impact health outcomes. And you can see from this data from 2018 that the percentage of white citizens increases in more affluent neighborhoods with higher neighborhood incomes. And what this really means is that minoritized communities are more likely to live in areas of concentrated poverty, and that the children from these groups are more likely to face health risks that accompany living in poverty. And it is well known that economic disadvantages increases the risk of poor health outcomes. These are data from Statistics Canada, and what you can see is the percent of Canadians who are living below the poverty threshold by age group. Children less than 18 years old make up the greatest proportion of people living in poverty, as seen in the left of this graph. And these data are from Public Health Ontario, and it shows food insecurity in the province. And food insecurity defined as the inability to obtain sufficient nutritious diet due to income-related access. And what you can see in this figure is that depending on where you live in our province, there can be up to 26% of families who cannot obtain nutritious food, which is a known risk factor for poor health. And imagine how this variable can affect your diabetes clinical trials, your obesity clinical trials. So diversity in biomedical research is really important because we know that there are multiple variables listed on this slide that can really affect a family's overall health, but also can affect a research team's ability to recruit families and to retain families in clinical trials. And other important member groups that I think need special attention are recent migrants to the country and also Indigenous populations, because they face current and historical differential challenges from some of the other marginalized racial and ethnic groups. So we're going to spend the last 15 minutes or so talking about barriers and solutions for clinical research diversity and equity. And much of what we're going to discuss in the following slides is summarized from this wonderful article published in 2023. And the figure from this article looks at the 4 main barriers to clinical trial participation, and we're going to discuss some of these today. And this is a report from the Health Equity Through Diversity Seminar Series, which is a wonderful series, and gives us a very nice framework of how to tackle these barriers. So barrier number 1 is that limited access to healthcare is a major barrier to clinical trial recruitment that can disproportionately impact racial and ethnic minorities. So this figure is from a paper published in 2021, and the paper is called Geographical Disparities in Access to Hospital Care in Ontario, a Spatial Coverage Approach. And what you can see in this figure is that the large hospitals and the teaching hospitals, where access to research typically occurs, are definitely not equitably distributed across the province. Limited access to healthcare can disproportionately affect racial minorities, And also research sites that are very distant from minority communities makes participation much more difficult due to transportation challenges and having to navigate physically unfamiliar locations, but also culturally unfamiliar environments. We also know that caregivers from racial and ethnic minority groups can face additional challenges in participating because they may have less spare time to get away from caregiving responsibilities, which makes extended travel very challenging. And then there are occupational restraints where certain families may be in more labor-intensive occupations and don't have the luxury of paid time off, making it hard to attend research visits during traditional working hours or if they have to travel far from their work. And that was Ontario data, but actually this week I discovered a very cool website called milkeninstitute.org, and they have an interactive map where you can actually search for proximity to clinical trial sites by different disease phenotypes. And on this slide, I put an example of a map that shows access to clinical trial sites for sickle cell disease in the United States. And what you can see in this map is that for many areas of the country, there is extremely low proximity to clinical trial sites for sickle cell disease. So if you want to look at all different types of clinical trials, disease phenotypes, these interactive maps are very, very interesting. So what are some of the solutions to access barriers? First, we have to really think hard about incentives and compensation. So if we are going to enroll patients who have access barriers, we really have to figure out how do we include incentives and compensation in our research budgets at the institutional level. Financial remuneration and reimbursements for study-related costs can decrease the burden on the most vulnerable families. In addition, we can consider new ways to provide transportation support, such as transportation vouchers that can help address these types of concerns. There's a very interesting study in adult colorectal cancer where a simple intervention just providing Uber vouchers for racialized patients made an incredible impact on their ability to participate in colorectal clinical trials. Next, there's childcare and elder care support. So when we think about families who have increased caregiver burden, providing financial support for childcare and elder care can help families if they have to miss work time and can incentivize participation. And then what about if we really thought outside the box and brought our research closer to the communities of interest? So instead of having patients come to what I'll say are ivory towers, we place our research clinics in community-based ambulatory settings and actually physically enhance accessibility and flexible timing. So considering, is it possible to offer evening or weekend research-related activities so that families who absolutely cannot get away from daytime work commitments have the opportunity to participate in clinical trials? In addition, one form of limited access is language barriers. So when we think about access to research, you know, how many times have we seen that this study is limited to English-speaking families? That's really an access barrier. And so if we're going to be inclusive, we have to spend time ensuring that our budgets and our staffing models can support in-person or virtual translation for informed consent. So important questions. What translation infrastructure is available at your study sites? Have you adequately budgeted for these services? And, you know, acknowledging upfront that research visits that require translation can take longer. So instead of sort of avoiding those longer visits, really, how can we plan accordingly? And how can we build it into our workflow that these non-English speaking families can be accommodated? And in the ideal situation, if you're choosing research sites or hiring new research staff, maybe you can really understand, you know, what are the languages we're going to encounter most commonly, and can we find bilingual research staff that match our target populations? Another way to overcome access barriers is to advertise outside of traditional routes. So this figure is from a company that works to improve research diversity. And what you can see on the horizontal axis is that the different ways that research participants learn about research opportunities. And what you can see is that patients from different racial backgrounds reported different ways that they first learned about research. So thinking outside the box and using alternative routes to advertise our clinical trials may allow us to reach more marginalized communities. Barrier number 2 is that many potential clinical trial participants, maybe especially those from racial and ethnic minority groups, can lack awareness of the available trials due to various different factors. So one issue is many clinical trials refer on physician referral. So participants learn about clinical trials through clinical visits with their doctors. But many racial and ethnic minorities receive clinical care outside of academic centers. And so the doctors in these community clinics may not be aware that these clinical trials are ongoing. And so being referred for your physician is a real barrier. In addition, we know that non-English speakers who are often from racial and ethnic minority groups face language barriers requiring interpretation and translating material for effective communication about trials. And it's really interesting, I'm on a national DSMB for some clinical trials in the United States. And these are clinical trials that are designed to enroll all patients in a certain clinic. And the way that they're letting the patients know that this research is going on are big flyers in the waiting room, but then when we asked, the big flyers in the waiting room, are they in English? They're only in English. And so all the patients in that clinic who can't read that flyer actually don't know that they're part of that clinical research study. Health literacy. So individuals with low health literacy can struggle to understand medical information, and this can affect their participation in our trials. And then research literacy above and beyond health literacy. So minority populations may have limited knowledge of how they can find research studies, how to understand research studies, and this can really limit their enthusiasm for participating. And what are some solutions to awareness barriers? So first, I think that we've made some headway in culturally relevant materials, but we have more work to do. So when you think about your study population and your patient population, how do we make study materials that are relevant and accessible and can actually reach minority groups more than what we're doing now? You could use something like a community ambassador, where these are individuals from marginalized communities who actually can help raise awareness and help increase the ability of marginalized communities to participate by disseminating information or being a knowledge resource for communities. Also, we can be more intentional about community engagement. So if we engage with communities through various different incentives, one of them that's really interesting is a community scientist academy, and I'm going to give an example of that at the end of the talk. We can think of creative ways to engage with historically marginalized communities to promote involvement in research. And then there are really methodological approaches such as community-based participatory research, which is a whole methodology around involving community stakeholders from the start of even inception of a clinical trial design and allow for true co-development of the protocol, recruitment strategies that are tailored to specific communities. And then really fostering long-standing partnerships. So really investing in academic, community, government partnerships that are not one-offs, that support individual clinical trials, but really are longitudinal relationships that can increase diversity in trial participation. But really this takes funding and intentional effort from all stakeholders. So this table is from a paper published in 2019, and I think this paper gives really great examples of themes of community contributions and the effect that community contributions can have on research. And I've highlighted a few key themes. So patient communities can have input on the topic or the aim of the research project. They can help us have insight and create less restrictive inclusion criteria, and they can help provide culturally sensitive training for intervention providers. The community contributions really can lead to research that is more meaningful to patients, protocols that are more aligned with the lived reality of our most vulnerable patients, and greater adherence and greater retention in clinical trials. So this paper gives wonderful examples of the way community engagement can shape our research. The third barrier is racism. Racism in its many forms is a critical factor that inhibits clinical trial diversity. So we know that there are complex issues that surround perceived, interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism, and these can serve as major obstacles to recruitment of racialized groups in research. So, lack of trust in the medical and scientific community is sometimes an uncomfortable topic for us as researchers. But we have to acknowledge that mistrust among certain racialized communities is linked to their experience of structural racism, their experience of health disparities, and well-earned medical mistrust. We also have to acknowledge as a research community that there have been historical abuses and unethical practices in medical research. And there are many examples of this, but there have been nutritional research in residential schools. There have been many egregious research examples in minority populations in the United States, and this leads to deep-seated mistrust among minority populations. Also, there's a well-warranted fear of experimentation. You know, because of the experience that minority groups have, they can really fear that participating in clinical trials can involve unethical experimentation or exploitation. And then, you know, I think oftentimes we talk about racism as something that maybe happened in the past, but I think we have to acknowledge that actually racism in healthcare interactions and ongoing racial disparities in healthcare quality contribute to the mistrust that can affect research participation. And we have to acknowledge that racial and ethnic minority populations, especially Black and Indigenous populations, experience worse health outcomes. And there's many factors, but this is in part due to receiving lower quality of care. So what are some solutions to racism barriers? First is that we have to not hide from this concept and actually address it. So we can actually incorporate into our research the idea that patients may have differential experience in their healthcare, and that we have to be comfortable sort of acknowledging this and addressing it. Second, discussions about increasing trust can focus on eliminating causes of mistrust rather than blaming minority populations or saying, oh yeah, that group of patients, they don't trust us, they're never going to participate in our research. Also, we have to be very careful and intentionally use the concept of race. So when we're designing our research, the inclusion of race should be clearly defined and accompanied by discussions on how racism can affect health outcomes. We have to make sure that our research teams are educated about historical traumas and how certain historical traumas in patient groups can affect how they perceive research consent and how they perceive participation in research. And then lastly, dissemination of results. So we have to go back and share our study results directly with participating communities and those impacted by the conditions that are being studied. And also this can foster engagement and trust. And I know that I promised Nancy that I would try to leave plenty of time for discussion. So I'm actually going to skip past barrier number 4 and skip towards the end of the talk. So I wanted to just share before we start our discussion what I think is a really exemplar program. So I trained at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland, and the University of Maryland is doing something very cool. So this city, Baltimore, is a city in the state of Maryland that has a lot of racial diversity, but also really long-standing history of racism, racial segregation, and health injustice. And the University of Maryland has created a very innovative program called the Patients Professors Academy. And this program actually educates community members who otherwise would never be able to engage with research teams and gives them the language and the tools to actively participate in clinical research design and execution. And what I think very neat is that a lot of times, even when patients go through these types of programs, there's still kind of a power differential when we bring families and researchers together at the same table, but they call the community members professor during the meetings. And this, something so small as a title, really can highlight how much we can learn from our community members. So in summary, I hope I've discussed that increasing diversity in clinical trials is critical for all populations to benefit from new knowledge, that structural disadvantage can impair optimal health and also impair a family's ability to engage in research, and that we must really, really intentionally focus on barriers and implementing real-world solutions. And this, if we are imaginative and we work hard, we have the potential to improve diversity in our clinical trials. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, for that very informative and enlightening talk. So, and thank you for leaving time for the question period. So we have about 12 minutes now for Q&A or discussion period with Dr. Lewis before we move on to the closed session this afternoon. So please go ahead. If it's available to you, please unmute or put your camera on if you'd like to ask a question, or go ahead and put your comments in the chat. I see one from Gunjan. Please go ahead, Gunjan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Louis. Such a lovely, wonderful presentation about the significance of EDI in research and clinical trials. I love this. I do attend a lot of presentations, but this is exceptional, wonderful presentation. I live in Toronto, in the province of Ontario, and you really mentioned about Ontario, about a lot of studies happening in Ontario and data related to Ontario as well. Wondering what federal, provincial, policies and practices are in place to support these clinical trials and include EDI in clinical trials? What is currently happening in Toronto and Ontario as well?
Thank you for your question. So I will say that I'm relatively new to Canada. So I'm actually still learning quite a bit about this exact question. You know, one thing that I found very interesting is that when we apply for federal funding in Canada, oftentimes we have to have sort of diversity statements and diversity plans as part of our grants, but it seems to relate more to the diversity of the research team and not necessarily our plans to enroll diverse patient populations in this research that kind of reflect the patients who are affected by the disease. And so I think, you know, at least the federal funding agencies are taking some step to bring this topic high on the mind of research teams when they write their grants. But I don't know that there's anything that I'm yet aware of that really forces research teams to be more deliberate to first understand, you know, what is the racial and ethnic distribution of their phenotype of interest in their clinical trial, and then to really be intentional about how are they going to design their protocol, what communities are they going to engage in order to enroll diverse participants. I'm very happy if other people who are on the Zoom, who've been in Ontario and Canada longer than I have, actually have examples of legislation or examples of efforts like that that are underway.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. That's very insightful and very authentic. Thanks.
Thank you. We also have a comment and a question in the chat that's coming through from Jillian. So they've noted that, this is going to be a treasured resource for their work in terms of the PowerPoint slides. So thanks for that comment. And she loved your note on work that gets meticulous attention and related resources, and how diversity needs meticulous attention and protected resources. So they note, as a non-scientist on their team, they start talking about engagement rigor and equity rigor in parallel with their colleagues' skills and attention to their professional training around rigor. And the question is, could you comment more on how we can work with our teams to shift the research system so that being meticulous on equitable engagement becomes the norm?
It's a really, really interesting question. So, it's something that I think a lot about, and it requires sort of a cultural shift. I think, as researchers, we are trained and we come up and we get so much training around, what is an endpoint? How do you measure an endpoint? How do you tell internal validity, external validity of your endpoints? How do you identify confounders? We learn so much about all this stuff. And then we really don't learn much about, how do these other social and economic factors that can vary tremendously between different patient subpopulations, how do those social and economic factors impact our research? We really don't learn about that. And so, first of all, I think as a community, we have to say, is this important? Like, do we all agree that this is important enough that it becomes something that our trainees learn about? I think Impact, by hosting this webinar, is taking a good step in that direction. But then also, individual institutions, I think research institutions also have a big responsibility to actually intertwine this concept in their research culture and in their research education culture. So, there should be curriculum about, how do these different aspects of social and economic disadvantage impact all different aspects of clinical trials, ability to, we talked about a lot of them, ability to access trials, ability to participate in the protocol when the protocol is written with the most advantaged patient group in mind. How does variable lived experience in the community affect our outcome of interest? So, for example, think about an asthma clinical trial. And think about, you're measuring PFTs after you give some sort of asthma medication, but all your kids live in a neighborhood with no, environmental air pollution, versus a trial where all the kids that you enroll have different environmental pollutant exposure, and that environmental pollutant exposure, more prevalent in marginalized communities, can impact their response to your drug. Those are the sort of nuanced things that I think as a community, we have to say, these things are important, and we are going to be much more intentional about learning about them. But also, as you mentioned, when people bring these topics up among their research team, oftentimes it's kind of dismissed, like, oh, like I understand, like in theory that's important, but I don't really have the knowledge or the tools to operationalize that. So we're going to just kind of move on. I mean, that's oftentimes what happens, and your example is a good example of that. And it's uncomfortable sometimes. It's uncomfortable to face the fact that us as researchers don't know enough about this, and we don't know how to account for it. And so oftentimes it's kind of glossed over, and we have to change the culture so we move away from that.
Thank you. Thank you. I think as everyone said in the chat, this has been a phenomenal webinar and real contribution. Thank you to our work and interests.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat here. Are there any plans for Health Canada to track and report race and ethnicity data in clinical trials similar to the FDA?
The answer to that is I'm not sure. I was surprised when I came to Canada to find that we actually don't routinely collect demographic information as part of our clinical encounters. So in the US, we can look at health disparities in outcomes by primary language spoken, or race or ethnicity. And a lot of medical centers in Canada actually don't collect that type of information, at least from what I'm learning and understanding. There is a shift, at least in the Greater Toronto area, to actually begin to collect more detailed and nuanced demographic information as part of our clinical encounters so that we can begin to look at equity and disparities. When that will translate into collecting that type of data for clinical trials that are Health Canada regulated or clinical trials that are reported to Health Canada, I don't know when that will be incorporated, but I think it's really, really important, because you saw the US data. If clinical trials are left to run as they typically run, the most advantaged patient groups will be much overrepresented, and marginalized patient groups will be severely underrepresented in the regulatory clinical trials. But if you don't actually look and you don't actually collect that data, you have no sense of how severe the problem is. So for example, in Canada, I can envision a situation where we have very poor representation of Indigenous populations in our clinical trials. But I at least haven't seen that data, and I don't know how close we are to Health Canada being interested in mandating collection of that type of data.
Thank you. We have another question coming in from the chat from Ipsita. So she's noting that she's seen many research coordinators advocate for many of the solutions that you outlined in your talk today, but they don't have the authority to implement those changes, especially because they can be costly, both in terms of time and for money. So she's wondering, do you have, what can be done to get buy-in from senior leaders, especially when they are things that cost more time and money?
This is cost and time and money is a very common point of discussion when I give this talk, because what I hear is that, our trial budgets are already constrained and the granting agencies already cut my budget before I even started. And so where is the money to translate the consent form into the 10 most common languages supposed to come from? Where is the money to do language translation to enroll non-English speaking families supposed to come from? And those are real questions that we have to grapple with as a research community. I see the question about the REB, and I actually think research ethic boards are a key point of intervention, because, a research ethics board can ask, is it ethical to do a clinical trial when you're functionally excluding marginalized families based on the protocol, based on whatever part of the study design? Is it ethical to do research in only English-speaking families when you know that that is going to functionally exclude a huge proportion of the minority families in your community? So, the research ethics board can, I think, have an impact by at least bringing these topics up with research teams. But I think more importantly, there has to be some standardization around how we budget for these items. How we have grant budget templates? Most grant budget templates do not have line items for these things that we're talking about. And so making sure that we actually include these issues when we're designing our clinical trial budgets, so that it's not something that we haven't budgeted for and we're trying to account for it in hindsight. And so actually I gave a similar version of this talk to our local REB here at Sick Kids, and we actually are talking about creating sort of like a social and economic stressor template to allow researchers to actually think more about, how do we give financial support to marginalized families that can't take time off of work? How do we give transportation support? how do we support translation services, and actually making a tool for research teams to use that is very explicit and allows research teams, even with limited proficiency in this space, to actually consider this when they design their studies and design their budgets. So that's just an idea that we have at this time. Maybe it's something that Impact can help us take on. But I think a tool like that is how you can allow, let's call them research leaders in quotation marks, to take this more seriously.
Thank you so much. So we're going to close this portion of the webinar now. As Chelsea noted, we will send out the slides and the resources from this talk, and please complete the feedback surveys. We love to hear your opinion on the webinars. If you are an Impact Fellow or an Impact Enrichment Group learner, please stay on this Zoom link and we will start our discussion period with Dr. Lewis in just a moment.